This episode includes discussions of bodily functions, so if you are eating, you may want to pause and come back later. It also touches on the difficult topic of infant mortality. Listener discretion is advised.
Bygone Echoes.
Welcome to Bygone Echoes, a history podcast. I'm your host, Courtney, and thank you so much for joining me today. I know it's been a while. My life lately has felt like juggling flaming swords. It's been exciting, chaotic, and given my lack of hand-eye coordination, hilariously disastrous. But hey, I have finally managed to put the swords down and I am ready to roll. So thanks for sticking around while I wrangled the circus act that is my life. I've missed you. And I am so excited to jump back into the wonderfully weird world of history together. Today, we are stepping back into the grime, grit, and gloom that was Victorian London, a place where the streets buzzed with city life, but also with something far more sinister. Imagine it's 1854. You're walking down a narrow cobblestone street in London's Soho neighborhood. The sky hangs in a perpetual gray, and the air is thick with the stench of human waste, rotting food, and industrial fumes. The streets are teeming with people from all walks of life, men in top hats and long coats, women in long skirts, and children, some barefoot, playing in the muck, oblivious to the danger around them. But beneath the everyday bustle, there's a palpable tension, a sense that something is terribly wrong. And that something is cholera. A deadly disease spreading through the city with alarming speed. People are falling sick by the dozens, and within days, sometimes even just hours, they are gone, claimed by a brutal and swift death. In 1854, the cause of cholera was a mystery. Was it carried in the air? Was it clinging to the very clothes on your back? Or was it a punishment for moral failings? No one really knew for sure. What was certain was that it struck without warning, affecting people of all ages, from the youngest children to the elderly. This ignorance only fueled the panic. Londoners were desperate for answers, but the prevailing wisdom of the time pointed to the miasma theory, the idea that diseases like cholera were spread by bad air. Imagine the chaos as people tried to purify the air around them, burning incense and herbs, covering their faces with handkerchiefs, staying indoors, all in this futile attempt to escape a disease that seemed to be everywhere yet nowhere at once. In this fog of confusion, as fear and dread continued to rise, two figures emerged to challenge the status quo. Dr. John Snow, a physician with a penchant for skepticism, and Reverend Henry Whitehead, a local clergyman with deep ties to the Soho community. These men were about to turn the world of public health on its head. Together, they would embark on a quest to uncover the true source of the cholera outbreak, leading to groundbreaking discoveries that would revolutionize our understanding of disease and shape the way that we design and safeguard our cities to this day. So, how did these two unlikely allies solve one of the greatest medical mysteries of their time? Let's follow their trail on the Ghost Map, a map that would uncover the deadly truth and change the course of history. Before we step into Soho, London, let's zoom out for a moment and take a look at what the rest of the world was up to during this time. The mid-19th century was a period of immense change and upheaval all across the globe, marked by revolutions, the rise of industrial powerhouses, and significant cultural shifts. So we have a lot to talk about. Europe was a continent in transition, torn between old empires and new ideologies, with power struggles and social unrest bubbling beneath the surface. The revolutions of 1848 had left a lasting impact, fueling the rise of nationalism and calls for social reforms across the region. Meanwhile, Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire were locked in the Crimean War, battling Russia in a conflict that dominated headlines and reshaped alliances. In Ireland, the Great Famine, which had sparked a massive wave of emigration that sent thousands abroad in search of better lives, was finally coming to a close. In Asia, the Qing dynasty was embroiled in the Taiping Rebellion, a devastating civil war that would become one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Japan, which had self-isolated for more than 2 centuries, was forced to open up to the West under the threat of violence from American Commodore Matthew Perry. In India, British control was tightening, with increasing interference in local governance and cultural traditions, setting the stage for uprisings like the Indian Rebellion of 1857. The Dutch, meanwhile, were solidifying their empire in the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, particularly in Java, after regaining control from the British in 1816 following the Napoleonic Wars. Africa was grappling with the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade and the encroachment of European colonial powers, with resistance to French and British expansion already taking root. The United States was driven by the ideology of manifest destiny, a justification for the genocidal removal of Native Americans from their ancestral lands. Entire tribes were forcibly displaced, their culture systematically erased, and their populations decimated through massacres, starvation, and disease. Policies like the Trail of Tears epitomized the violence inflicted on the natives, while forced relocation to reservations ensured their continued suffering. Meanwhile, Abraham Lincoln, not quite yet president, and other politicians were grappling with the escalating tensions over slavery as the nation inched closer and closer to civil war. At the same time, innovations like the telegraph were shrinking distances, with submarine telegraph cables enabling the first rapid communication between continents. And the world was becoming more and more interconnected, and now events that happened in one nation could easily ripple across to others. America's rapid expansion depended heavily on immigrant labor. Irish and German workers, in particular, were essential to the country's growth in the 1850s, taking on some of the hardest and most dangerous jobs in factories, mining, and infrastructure projects. They worked long hours for low pay, often in very unsafe conditions, while also facing heavy discrimination. Their labor was not just critical, it was the backbone of America's progress at that time. It is worth asking how much of our history is built on the efforts of people who weren't treated with the dignity they deserve. Immigrants, in particular, have long been the backbone of growing economies, taking on grueling jobs that others often avoided. Even today, they face many of the same challenges: low wages, unsafe conditions, and systematic inequalities. Recognizing their contributions is not about pointing fingers, it's about understanding that a country's progress comes with the responsibility to value and protect the people driving it forward. This idea of overlooked contributions ties directly to our story today. In 1854, the cholera outbreak in London didn't just align with the flaws in public health systems, it also exposed the way that society's most vulnerable groups of people are often left to shoulder its greatest burdens. At first glance, the outbreak might seem like a localized crisis, a grim but relatively small event compared to the sweeping revolutions, wars, and innovations during that era. I mean, cholera had hit London before, it even hit London after this period. But in reality, it was a turning point, a disaster with profound global implications that reshaped the way we understood city building, public health, and disease. Right in the heart of London's West End, the neighborhood of Soho covers roughly 1 square mile, or about 2.6 kilometers. Soho started as farmland with a leper hospital nearby, became a royal park under Henry VIII, and later transformed into a residential district, growing organically into a maze of streets and alleys which never really quite made sense on a map. This isn't super related, but I'm gonna throw it in there anyway. So during the Great Plague of London in 1665, a mass burial pit was created in Soho, which earned the area a very grim reputation. The plague pit in Soho was so massive and infamous that it was said that
it was a field not to be passed without a shudder by any Londoner of that age. There, as in a place far from the haunts of men, had been dug, 20 years before, when the Great Plague was raging, a pit into which the dead carts had nightly shot corpses by scores. It was popularly believed that the earth was deeply tainted with infection and could not be disturbed without imminent risk to human life.
ooh, how spooky. But in reality, development just stalled temporarily. Right after the plague ended, people started building. By the 18th century, the neighborhood flourished as a fashionable district, home to elegant Georgian homes and London's growing middle class. The neighborhood was well maintained with beautiful cobblestone streets that just added to the charm and appeal. But in the early 19th century, things really began to change for Soho. The neighborhood's wealthier residents started packing up and moving out. The Industrial Revolution brought in waves of new, often poor, people to London, all chasing better opportunities, and Soho quickly became overcrowded. As the neighborhood filled up, living conditions declined, and public health issues grew. Meanwhile, shiny new neighborhoods were popping up all across London, offering more modern amenities, cleaner air, and a more exclusive vibe, making them irresistible to those who could afford a better quality of life. As those who could afford to leave Soho left, their old grand Georgian homes were snatched up by opportunistic landlords eager to cash in on the influx of new residents. These landlords wasted no time chopping up the properties into cramped apartments, tenements, shop fronts, and squeezing as many people as they could into each building to maximize their profits. With little to no investment in upkeep or sanitation, these once elegant homes quickly deteriorated, becoming overcrowded, unsanitary, and unsafe. The cobblestone roads, once smooth and charming, had grown worn and uneven, making every step a bit of a gamble. These homes were often filled by working-class families from rural England, along with immigrants from Ireland and across Europe, all drawn to London in search for work and a better life. Jobs in factories, mills, and workshops promised better wages than farming ever could. Soho also became a haven for political exiles during the 19th century, thanks to its central location in London and its existing diverse community. French political refugees, Italian and German nationalists, and Polish and Russian exiles all found a home in Soho, adding to the neighborhood's rich cultural scene. But London was growing fast. Too fast. The city's infrastructure was not designed to support such a rapid influx of people. Soho in 1850 was suffocatingly overcrowded, with over 300 people per acre crammed into the narrow streets and tightly packed buildings. The air was thick with foul odors and sanitation was almost non-existent, turning neighborhoods into breeding grounds for disease. Water, one of the most basic necessities, was scarce and unreliable. Most residents did not have access to clean running water in their homes. Instead, they relied on the communal pumps, which were wells scattered throughout the neighborhood, which literally there were water pumps, and I can't even conceptualize in my mind today that my only source of water would come from a community pump. Wild. Anyway, the only water that most people could drink came from the pumps that drew water from underground sources. These were often contaminated by filth and waste that permeated the area. Sewage systems, as we know them today, were largely absent. Human waste was typically disposed of in cesspools, these large, overflowing pits located beneath or kind of near behindish buildings. And so when these cesspools overflowed, as they often did, the waste seeped into the groundwater, turning the public water supply into a breeding ground for yuck. Waste and garbage were another major issue. With no waste collection, refuse piled up into the streets or into cesspools. This attracted rats and other vermin. The Thames, the city's main waterway, became a dumping ground for both industrial waste, human sewage, and water from this source was commonly called monster soup. The stench of the rotting food, human waste, and industrial fumes filled the air, contributing to an atmosphere that was both physically and psychologically oppressive. For the poor and working class residents of Soho, these conditions weren't just unpleasant, they were a ticking time bomb. Overcrowded, unsanitary, and ignored by the city's elite, the neighborhood was primed for disaster. And in August of 1854, that disaster struck, turning grim potential into a harrowing reality. Think about the worst stomach ache you've ever had. Maybe it was food poisoning or a stomach bug that left you curled up, barely able to move or even keep water down. Now, imagine that pain is intensifying with sharp, relentless cramps gripping your abdomen. Nothing is helping. As the hours pass, you're losing fluids rapidly from both ends, and dehydration sets in. Your body begins to spasm uncontrollably. Your skin turns cold and bluish, and your eyes sink into your face. By that evening, the severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalance cause your organs to fail, sending your body into shock. For those hit with cholera, what was probably the beginning of a normal day could end with their death before the day was even over. Cholera had been lurking in human history long before it reached the streets of London. The disease's origins trace back to the Indian subcontinent, where descriptions of symptoms like those we just talked about can be found as far back as the 5th century BC. But it wasn't until the 19th century that cholera went global, thanks to the expanding trade routes and colonialism. The first cholera pandemic began in 1817, sweeping across Southeast Asia before spreading to the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. The word cholera actually comes from the Greek word cholera, which means bile or sickness from bile. People had been using it for centuries to describe nasty stomach illnesses long before they knew what actually caused it. By 1854, London had already endured multiple cholera outbreaks, and at this point, the city's residents knew the drill. They had science on their side. Clearly, it was just some super bad miasma. Miasma, the bad air that comes from decaying or foul-smelling things. That's what it was. The city's poor sanitation meant foul smells were constant. But after the hottest summer months, the colder weather of an autumn often brought air that seemed less noxious. Since cholera outbreaks often coincided with summer, they assumed that once the cooler weather set in, the threat had passed. And without scientific understanding, they saw cholera as something that kind of just blew in and blew out with the changing seasons. On a larger scale, there were some public work efforts aimed at tackling the filth problem. The city had started rudimentary sanitation projects, clearing away refuse and waste, especially in the poorer neighborhoods. But these efforts were painfully slow. After all, no one had ever tried to clean up a city of this size before. And with the waste still pouring into the Thames and drinking water from local pumps being contaminated, these actions didn't address the real issue, which was the polluted water. However, not everyone was convinced by the miasma theory. Enter the incredibly observant Jon Snow. No, not the guy from Game of Thrones, but still cool name, right? Born in 1813 to a working-class family in York, John worked his way up and, by 1838, had become a physician. He started out in surgery and general medicine, setting up his practice right in Soho. It didn't take long for him to make a name for himself, though, in anesthesiology. In fact, he was one of the first to use ether and chloroform as anesthetics, even administering chloroform to Queen Victoria during the birth of 2 of her children. Pretty amazing, right? John's work as a physician brought him to ground zero of the cholera outbreaks. He was in the community, treating patients, and saw firsthand how miasma was not able to account for the way cholera was spreading throughout the population. He noticed that cholera hit certain groups harder, even in the same neighborhood, and it missed other groups entirely. If it was all in the air, then everyone should have been sick, but that's not what was happening. During the 1848 outbreak, John noticed a pattern. People who got their water from certain sources were getting cholera, while others weren't. This got him thinking, maybe it's the water, not the air. But Snow was all about evidence, and he cared because he wanted to save lives. A science and data nerd after my own heart. But John wasn't content to just go with the miasma crowd. He knew figuring this out could stop the spread, and that's why he dug deeper into the waterborne theory. But he had to wait for another cholera outbreak to occur in order to test his theory. But John wasn't the only one making these observations in the community. Reverend Henry Whitehead, born in 1828 in Kent, England, was a curate in the Soho area, specifically serving the St. Luke's Church in Berwick Street, Soho. His role as a curate meant that he was regularly visiting the sick, comforting families, and attending to the daily spiritual needs of his parishioners. He was deeply invested in the cholera outbreak because it hit his community hard. His parishioners were the ones getting sick and dying, and for him it was personal. Although he did believe in the miasma theory, based on his own observations, he felt a responsibility to figure out what was really going on so that he could protect his community. In a tiny apartment at 40 Broad Street lived Sarah and Thomas Lewis. Thomas worked as a police constable, while Sarah managed the household and cared for their 3 children, a 16-year-old, an 11-year-old, and the newest addition to the family, baby Frances. At just 5 months old, you can't help but wonder if little Frances had started rolling over on her own or babbling to the family, hitting those important milestones for little ones. But unfortunately, Frances had fallen ill with a severe bout of diarrhea, and Reverend Whitehead, deeply committed to his parishioners' well-being, visited the family on August 24th to offer comfort and spiritual support. Sarah was probably worried. Diarrhea can be especially dangerous in infants. She may have mentioned to Whitehead that Frances's cloth diapers contained this strange stool, and although the doctor had already been by and concluded that the baby did not have cholera, there was not much else that anyone could do. So Whitehead probably offered some comfort to the worried mother and said a prayer or 2 before leaving to visit the next family. Frances would succumb to the illness on September 2nd, 1854. Tragically, her death marked the beginning of a devastating cholera outbreak that swept through the neighborhood, claiming hundreds of lives in the days that followed. When the cholera hit, Dr. Jon Snow saw an opportunity to test his theory that the cholera was spread through contaminated water and not the air. He quickly jumped into action, going door to door, asking people where they got their water from and whether or not anyone in the household had fallen ill. Using this information, he created a very detailed map of the neighborhood, plotting cholera cases with small black circles at exact locations where people had died. At the same time, Whitehead was also investigating the outbreak. He was going door to door, speaking with families, gathering information, and trying to piece together the clues, all in an effort to trace the source of the disease. This caused him to cross paths with Snow, and the 2 men made an unlikely team dedicated to getting to the bottom of this mystery. Initially, Whitehead did not think Snow was right about the water being the source of sickness because, miasma. But after talking to his parishioners, he started noticing that a lot of people who got sick had been drinking from one specific water pump, and he and Snow identified the culprit as the Broad Street water pump. Within days of the outbreak's onset, Snow and Whitehead had determined the likely cause. They noted that most of the cholera cases were clustered around the pump, that specific pump, and that the brewery workers who had consumed beer instead of the pump's water were largely unaffected. On September 7th, 1854, Snow presented his findings to the Board of Guardians for St. James Parish, arguing that the pump was the source of the contamination and recommending that they remove its handle immediately. Side note here, I had no idea what a Board of Guardians was, so I had to look it up. So it turns out that they oversaw a lot of things in the local community, including the water and the sanitation. So Snow couldn't just go and remove the pump handle himself, he needed their approval. So he showed them his data and his maps, and he's like, look at all this wonderful evidence that I have. And they agreed to remove it on September 8th, 1854. But it is important to note that they didn't remove it because they believed Snow. They just were desperate at this point and willing to try anything. Once the pump handle was removed, new cholera cases declined almost immediately. While removing the pump handle helped curb the outbreak, the true source of the contamination was not yet fully understood. Determined to find answers, Reverend Whitehead continued his investigation and revisited Sarah Lewis, Francis's grieving mother. Tragically, shortly after Francis's death, her husband, Thomas Lewis, also succumbed to cholera. During their conversation, Sarah shared some critical information. She had been cleaning Francis's soiled diapers in a basin and dumping the wastewater into the household cesspit. This cesspit, connected just feet from the Broad Street water pump, was poorly maintained and leaking into the groundwater that fed the pump. She also revealed that after Thomas had become ill with cholera, around the same time the pump handle was removed, she had been washing his soiled belongings and dumping that same dirty water into the same cesspit. If the handle had not been removed when it was, the contaminated pump would have continued to spread cholera throughout the neighborhood, worsening the already devastating outbreak. This revelation was amazing. It provided the final crucial piece of evidence that Snow needed to prove his waterborne theory. The contamination pathway was clear, and Snow's map became a foundation of his argument. It wasn't just a collection of data points, it told a chilling story of a killer lurking unseen in the heart of Soho. The map's stark visualization of death clusters around the Broad Street pump gave it an almost spectral quality, as if it were capturing the ghostly trails of the disease itself. And this eerie impression earned it the name the Ghost Map, a haunting yet groundbreaking tool that remains a landmark in the history of epidemiology. Fortunately, Snow would not live to see the full impact of his work. The medical establishment immediately dismissed much of his research during his lifetime. It was not until the 1860s, when London's sewer system was redesigned, that the connection between cholera and contaminated water was widely accepted. The 1854 outbreak didn't just change how we understood cholera, it reshaped how we think about disease and disease transmission altogether. It showed that solving public health crises required not just good science, but also collaboration, community trust, and a willingness to challenge the established ideas. The partnership between John Snow and Reverend Whitehead remains a testament to what's possible when science and compassion come together. But their work didn't just save lives in Soho, it set a precedent for public health efforts worldwide and gave us a chilling yet invaluable tool, the Ghost Map, a reminder of how far public health has come and how far we still have to go. The fight against cholera in 1854 was not just about disease, it was a clash of ideas. At the time, germ theory was still an emerging concept, championed by only a few forward-thinking scientists. The prevailing belief? Cholera was spreading through miasma, the bad air. This theory was rooted in ancient Greek medicine, and it had dominated medical thought for centuries. The idea that invisible organisms in the water could carry disease wasn't just radical, it was unthinkable for many. When John Snow presented his findings linking cholera to contaminated water, he faced stiff resistance. Most health officials dismissed his data, calling it circumstantial. Even the Board of Guardians, who approved of removing the Broad Street pump handle in the first place, didn't believe his theory. They were acting out of desperation, not conviction. And resistance wasn't purely scientific. Admitting that cholera was waterborne meant confronting an uncomfortable truth. London's water supply was filthy, and fixing it would be expensive. Many of the wealthier classes, who lived far from the overcrowded and unsanitary neighborhoods hit hard by cholera, saw no reason to spend such resources on the poor. The unwillingness to address systematic inequality meant the epidemic was as much a social crisis as a medical one. The poorest residents of Soho bore the brunt of the outbreak. They lived in the cramped, unsanitary conditions. They relied on the shared pumps and cesspits, and they had little to no control over their environment. Meanwhile, wealthier residents with access to safe water sources and cleaner living conditions were largely unaffected. This disparity wasn't incidental, it was systematic. The neglection of the working class neighborhoods perpetuated cycles of vulnerability, leaving them to shoulder the worst of the public health crisis. And here's the thing, it's not just history. Even today, public health inequalities persist. Just think back to the Flint, Michigan water crisis, where systematic neglect left predominantly Black residents without safe drinking water for years. And this is a reminder of how poverty and racism and classism still dictate who suffers the most during a health crisis. The story of Soho in 1854 underscores a lesson that we're still learning today. Public health is inseparable from social justice. The immediate aftermath of the 1854 cholera outbreak did not look promising for John Snow. His waterborne theory was largely dismissed, and his groundbreaking research went unacknowledged by much of the medical community. Snow passed away in 1858, just 4 years after the Broad Street outbreak, never fully seeing the impact of his work. But his efforts were not in vain. Over time, the evidence connected cholera to contaminated water became undeniable. In the 1860s, John Bazalgette, which I probably butchered that, spearheaded a massive overhaul of London's sewer system. By improving sanitation and separating drinking water from sewage, the cholera outbreaks drastically were reduced. This project set a global example of urban infrastructure reform, inspiring cities around the world to invest in clean water and sanitation. Snow's findings also revolutionized urban planning. Clean water supplies, effective sewage systems, and better housing became essential components of cities' designs, transforming disease-prone neighborhoods into healthier, more livable spaces. His work laid the foundation for the modern cityscape as we know it today. Beyond city planning, Snow's methods transformed public health. His use of data visualization, like the Ghost Map, and his reliance on case interviews became cornerstones of modern epidemiology. These tools have been crucial in tackling diseases from cholera to COVID-19 to Ebola, where mapping infections has been vital for containment efforts. His influence is also seen in the work of global organizations like the World Health Organization and UNICEF, which prioritize clean water access as a public health cornerstone. But as much progress as we have made, the fight for clean water is not over. Millions worldwide still lack access to clean, safe drinking water, making them vulnerable to preventable diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. Even in wealthier nations, crises like Flint reveal how systematic neglect can compromise water safety. The legacy of John Snow and the Broad Street outbreak isn't just a historical milestone, it's a call to action. It reminds us that public health requires vigilance, innovation, and a commitment to equity. From the crowded streets of 19th century London to today's global health challenges, Snow's work remains a guiding light for how we protect lives and build healthier futures for everyone. And that is the story of the 1854 cholera outbreak in Soho, how a physician with an eye for patterns and a clergyman with a heart for his community unraveled one of history's most devastating medical mysteries. Their collaboration not only saved lives, but it revolutionized public health and urban planning, setting a precedent that we still benefit from today. But let's not forget the broader lesson here. Public health crises don't occur in a vacuum. They reveal the fractures in our system, exposing deeper inequalities that leave our most vulnerable at risk. From the 19th century Soho to Flint, Michigan, the fight for clean water and the dignity that it represents continues. Public health is a shared responsibility, and stories like this inspire us to stay curious, compassionate, and committed to equity. If you enjoyed this episode, I would love it if you shared it with someone else who loves weird, fascinating history as much as you do. Or even if you just left a review on your favorite podcast app. Reviews help more people find the show, and I would be so grateful to have your support in growing our Bygone Echoes community. Thanks for tuning in today. And remember, be kind, be curious, and be ready to make history.
Interested in learning more? We recommend The Ghost Map by Stephen Johnson, Dirty Old London, The Victorian Fight Against Filth by Lee Jackson, Cholera, the biography by Christopher Hamlin, The Sanitary City, Urban Infrastructure in America from Colonial Times to the Present by Martin V. Melosi. For digital resources, check out our website at www.bygoneechoes.website.